You're listening to Table Talks for Life, a Y for Life podcast that prepares youth to be gospel-motivated voices for life. Be sure to stick around after today's live recording to find out how you can be engaged in upholding life too. Welcome to Table Talks for Life. Today we are taking another look at what's on the table when we look at contemporary news stories and how they might relate to life issues. So we have two news stories that we're going to share today. Real quick, I'm Michelle Bauman, Director of Y for Life, and I have two guests with me today that are also part of the Y for Life team. So if you want to go ahead and introduce yourselves, that would be great.
I'm Bonnie. I'm the Media Resource Assistant with Y for Life.
And I'm Corey. I am the Y for Life assistant.
Excellent. So, ladies, we chose two different articles. The first one is about Opill, and I hope I'm saying that right. Back in May, so maybe a couple months ago, but it's getting a lot of press even now. The FDA approved the sale of Opill, which is an over-the-counter drug. Over-the-counter birth control pill that women will be able to use without a prescription, obviously, and without any doctor's supervision. It looks like it will be available in America in early 2024, but it's been available overseas in Ireland for quite some time. So I thought we should consider this. We should talk about this because obviously birth control has lots of connections to life issues. There's been a concerted effort lately to make more birth control available to people, especially with abortion bans, which I think we should talk about that as well, and the move toward protecting life in the womb. So kind of as an introductory question, what do you think we need to consider before we engage in the use of birth control? What is the Christian's view of birth control?
Well, there's a lot to that question, but I think two helpful starting questions are, first of all, what are we talking about when we say birth control? Because there are many different kinds, but basically they fall into two different categories, which is whether they're a true contraceptive. A lot of times that word contraceptive is used as like a blanket term for all birth control, but that's not the case. So some are contraceptive, which would be things like barrier methods, abstinence, obviously, spermicides, natural family planning, or sterilization. But then there are, in the other category, things that can potentially be abortifacient. So those would be like IUDs and any hormonal birth control. And basically, hormonal birth control has three mechanisms of action, so the first, it prevents ovulation. The second, it thickens cervical mucus to prevent fertilization. So both of those would be true contraceptives. They don't allow conception to take place. But this third mechanism of action is that it basically thins the uterine lining to prevent implantation. And for preventing implantation, at that point, the embryo is already there, alive. That's a human life. So that would be an abortion. And we don't know how often that third mechanism actually happens, but we do know that it can happen because birth control can fail on all three accounts. People can become pregnant while on birth control. So we have to say no to something that can potentially be abortive. So I think that's the first helpful question, is to even know what we're talking about when we're talking about birth control. And then the second would be, what context is it being used in? So is this a married couple that's using it, or just someone who's interested in promiscuity, basically wanting to have unmarried sex or sex outside of marriage, just kind of on the side, unbeknownst to people, to keep it secret or whatever? And then if it is within a marriage, how is the married couple approaching it? Is it, oh, we don't want to have kids, or we just want to focus on our careers, or whatever number of reasons that don't align with why people get married, or how God has instituted marriage? Or do they have reasons for potentially delaying God's gift of children? So I think those are two helpful questions.
Yeah, and I love the fact that you defined that for us, right? The difference between a contraceptive and an abortifacient, because again, you're right, those are often intermingled and made very unclear. And I think it's also important to, when we look at the Christian view of birth control, to start where God starts, and that is that children are a gift. right? That marriage and family are intended to be gifts that were given to Adam and Eve in the garden. And so we know they are inherently good. And we also know that the gift of children teaches us a great deal, right? It teaches us how to be selfless. It teaches us unconditional love. It better helps us understand the love that God has for us as his children, right? When we raise our own children. And so even before we ask the question, should we be using contraceptives or birth control? And we want to start with the idea that children are always, no matter circumstances, a blessing created by God, given by God, to both a man and a woman. And so you're right. And then we move on from there, right? What are some reasons why birth control might be necessary or beneficial to the family for a time, right? Or at least permissible, right? Corey, did you have something you want to jump in on?
Yeah, I guess the other consideration is I know that a lot of times birth control is also prescribed as, oh, well, a woman is having either infrequent or, oh, I guess too frequent of menstrual cycle, those sorts of things, or different things that fall into those categories, things like endometriosis or PCOS. And so birth control is also prescribed in situations like that. I should say the hormonal birth control is usually prescribed in situations like that. So that's something else I just wanted to just put out there for Christians to be aware of is, if you are someone dealing with those issues, it's something to definitely talk to your doctor about and say, maybe you aren't married and you're not wanting to be promiscuous and have extramarital sex or anything like that, but you are having issues like that and your doctor wants to offer you birth control as an option. And I know that the O pill is not meant for that, but just touch on that too, of like, there are a lot of females that is the first thing the doctor recommends to them is, oh, well, if your menstrual cycle is not regular, then we need to put you on birth control. It doesn't matter if they're sexually active or not. So that was just something I wanted to bring into it as well, is as a Christian, considering those things also, if you're someone who is abstaining and waiting for marriage.
Yeah, and we definitely want to talk about maybe the side effects of hormonal birth control, because you're right, it's good to have an honest conversation with your doctor to find out what those side effects are, what risk factors you might have, and sometimes that is the option, right? That is the best option to help care for and uplift the life of the individual who's suffering. But sometimes there are other options, right? So doing that research so that you can get the best medical advice and care for your body, not only for today, but also for the future. Before we go on to those side effects, though, let's talk a little bit about O pill, how it might. So there are two types of hormonal birth control. One that has estrogen and progesterone in it, and one that only has progesterone. And O pill is a progesterone-only pill. And so Bonnie did a great job of kind of explaining the three elements that a hormonal pill will often do, right? Or the three things that it will do to prevent pregnancy, right? So prevent ovulation, thicken the cervical mucus, and then thin the uterine lining. But what we know for progesterone-only pills is that their primary work is really in thinning the uterine lining. In fact, some research shows that up to 40% of the time women will ovulate normally. So again, if a woman is ovulating, right? If she is releasing an egg monthly, the chance of that egg meeting with sperm in a marital relationship is much higher. And if a baby, is conceived and then comes into that uterus that isn't ready to sustain that baby's life, we have an abortion, an abortion that happens, right? Unbeknownst to the mom or to the dad. but we want to educate ourselves to know that that's a risk, and that it is a fairly significant one. 40% of ovulation. I mean, that's pretty high, right?
So essentially what you're saying is that can happen in both combination pills and progesterone only pills, but progesterone only pills are definitely not the way to go, the move for like big pharma to go for birth control, because even more than combination pills, it probably causes even more of those sort of unknown abortions.
Yeah.
With its
Yeah,
mechanism.
that's exactly right. And most often progesterone only pills were given, and I think very often, even today, to moms who maybe have just delivered a baby, right? To give the mom's body some time to care for the newborn and to recover, right? So that's a very common type of birth control that's given to moms who just become moms or just had another child. But now it's going to be offered on the market for everyone. And again, I think most women who take progesterone only pills don't realize the increased risk of that abortifacient mechanism. And certainly if you are listening today and this is you, right? You've taken a progesterone only and you didn't have any idea, please know that this too is covered under forgiveness, under the grace of Christ. And it is a sin that Christ paid for on the cross, right? And so we do not need to carry that or bear that guilt anymore. But it's good to know. It's good to know so we can make choices in the future that are life affirming.
I think this is an issue that's really can be very hard to talk about, basically for the reason that you just mentioned, which is like it's a very private thing, so people don't necessarily know you don't really know who you're talking to if you're talking about it, whether they've used it or what. But I know, I feel like a generation ago, this kind of information was just never talked about. I know, like my mom has said that she sort of like learned about all this stuff later in life, and she was just like, yeah, doctors now don't talk about it, but like even within the church didn't talk about it. And it is hard because it's a very serious thing, and so it obviously can trigger a ton of guilt, especially if somebody didn't know and then they're just learning about it. But the solution to that is not to just sweep it under the rug and say, well, it's kind of sensitive, so let's not even go there, because it's like we don't trust exactly what you were saying, the forgiveness that we have in Christ, that wouldn't cover it, or that people couldn't like bring that to Jesus and allow him to forgive their sin, because sin is sin whether you know it or not, right, at the time. And so but forgiveness is free in Christ, so we're not losing anything by telling the truth about what we've learned about these drugs.
Right. And like your mom, I would agree. I think that even maybe some doctors, to put the best construction on it, weren't aware, right? So I remember having discussions with my doctors, and some of them Christian doctors that I knew were Christian doctors, right? And asked specifically for information on the hormonal birth control pill. Was it, is it abortifacient? And I have never once had a doctor answer, yes, it is. And so, not to break the 8th commandment, to put the best construction in it, maybe it is research that wasn't done, or doctors weren't aware, but it is research that has been done now. And so it is important to know and to share that information. So, but you're right, Bonnie, it is a sin. God is greater than this. God forgives this sin too. And we rest in him, right? Go ahead, Corey.
I was going to say, I think that's one of the blessings of the internet. For all of its downfalls, we do have this research readily available at our fingertips. So maybe if our doctors aren't fully transparent with us, we can still go do that research ourselves. And I will say, maybe you look at scientific sources and not just anecdotal sources for instances like this. But definitely I know for a fact that the insert that comes with any birth control over like prescription birth control is very long. So, you know, it may be you take some time over the course of weeks, months to do the research, but that is, like I said, it is one of the blessings that we have on the internet, is that research is there for us to do. And we can repent of those sins if that is something that we participated in the past too. We have the blessing of prayer is free, and we can always go to God. So
Yeah. What about, you had brought up earlier the side effects of hormonal birth control and, checking into that, right? Not only how it affects our child's life, potentially, but how does it affect the woman? And by the way, I just want to throw it out there for those who are listening to this podcast, and really want to delve into this research. I'd recommend APLOG. So it's the American Association of Pro-Life OBGYNs. And they have lots of good research on there, including brochures that you can purchase to share with others that clarify what hormonal birth control does, how likely it is that ovulation occurs, and then also some of the long-term effects. So they're not the only site, but that is just a powerhouse of information. So again, that's American Association of Pro-Life OBGYNs, so APLOG. All right, so back to what are some of the things that what are some of the side effects of hormonal birth control?
yeah, so I pulled up the FDA page on Opill because I was curious to see what they had to say. And then I'll go into some of the other, I guess I'll call them anecdotal, because there's still some back and forth on if it's actually been studied or not, but some of those side effects that women report otherwise. But the FDA says that this Opill, the common side effects may include irregular vaginal bleeding, nausea, breast tenderness, and headaches, and that the side effects are generally mild and often resolve on their own. So that's a very short list of side effects for something that is completely taking over your hormones, basically. I will say, like, there's got to be a lot more that goes into it than just those four things. But anecdotally, women have said that hormonal birth control, has caused those issues, but also weight gain is one that a lot of women see while they're on the pill. And again, that's more of an anecdotal. There's not been a lot of studies on that by organizations like the FDA, and I don't think they're ever going to look into it, if I'm being honest. But then another one that I've heard recently is a lot of anxiety and depression spikes while on hormonal birth control. I don't know, Bonnie, if you have any others that you've heard about, or Michelle, you've heard others, but those are the ones that I've heard about outside of, the things that are labeled as common side effects.
Well, yeah, certainly those things. I don't have a ton off the top of my head for like immediate side effects, but one thing that, and Michelle, you alluded to this, is the long-term effects that they're kind of beginning to look at. So things like increased risk of heart attack, stroke, depression and suicide, breast cancer, cervical cancer, decreased bone density, and then issues with fertility as well. And so all of these not good things. And it's fascinating to me because I've noticed this movement away from hormonal birth control completely irrespective of Christianity or like recognizing kind of the life issues that we're talking about today, as in how they can be abortive, because these medications aren't healthy. They're causing women a lot of issues. And so totally apart from religion and what your take is on that, they're like, we don't want to take this. It's making us feel bad and we're having lots of negative effects from it. Find us something better, basically. So I think that's a really powerful argument that can be used, or just a good testimony to be used to show that we shouldn't be taking these things. They, like you said, they totally take over your hormones. You're kind of completely messing with your reproductive system through hormones, and there's a lot of negative effects from that. And whether or not you're pro-life, people don't like to take medication that makes them feel bad. So I'm hopeful that can be used to sort of swing away from hormonal birth control towards more acceptable life-affirming methods.
Right. And I think, again, that the infertility piece, right? The long-term pieces, when people understand the possibility of a connection with that, there's some really good research out there too, with the potential connection to cancer, as well as progesterone-only pills, that there's a slight increase, but significant increase in the possibility of ectopic pregnancies as well. So when we look at overall the picture of what hormonal birth control pills can do, we should be hesitant to jump into that. I think that it is just assumed in today's culture that at some point you're going to be on the pill, whether it's before marriage, you're getting ready to get married, so you've got to go to your doctor, get on the pill before you get married, whether it's again, for promiscuity purposes, or for what some would say safe sex, or at least safer sex options. But we have to weigh in not only what's happening to our bodies today, but also what's happening to our bodies for life. And it seems like maybe we could say that hormonal birth control is not a really great option for the woman or for the child. So that was, kind of my last question was, what do you guys think for over-the-counter birth control? Good idea, bad idea, dangers, positives? What are your thoughts?
So my mom is a pharmacist, and she and my grandfather are both pharmacists. They own the pharmacy, very local. So I see this from that perspective of, I know they're not going to carry it. They're both pro-life. They don't even carry Plan B at the pharmacy. So I think that from that aspect, it's tough when you're the pharmacist who is going to be pressured into getting these things. Like, maybe you work for a national chain and you work for, I don't know, like a Walmart or a Walgreens or a CVS, where they're definitely going to carry this. And then you're going to be convicted of, like, well, I don't believe in birth control. And if someone's not doing their research, I think from that aspect, it's a terrible idea, because you're going to be causing a lot of people to question their convictions and potentially need to look for other jobs, things like that. But then just from a layperson aspect, I think it's also a terrible idea, just because, again, people aren't doing research. You could have someone under the age of 18 going in to try to buy this without parental consent, and not talking to a doctor about what the side effects might be, because they think, well, I want to be cool. I want to show all my friends that I have this, like, birth control thing or whatever. And I think there's just terrible implications to that. I mean, and anyone over the age of 18, also terrible implications, but there's no indication that there's going to be age limits placed on purchasing this. There's no indication that people under the age of 18 or over, there's no age limits on who should be taking this, and there's no research being done by those kids. So that's one thing that I see as just a really bad outcome of this, is that there's going to be a lot more people thinking they need this than actually do, and having access to it than actually need to have access to it.
And with those side effects that are life-threatening, there's no doctor supervision, right? There's no one who knows potentially that you're on this medication, and how that might be interacting with other medications that you're taking. I know there's obviously a real push from Planned Parenthood and other organizations that actually benefit from people having sex before marriage. And so this is one of the ways, again, our young people are going to be pressured into or encouraged to embrace a culture that sees sex as, in essence, meaningless, sex as something that is just done for the moment, for the moment's pleasure, rather than something that is a beautiful expression of love between a married couple, one that can result in the procreation of life.
Yeah, I definitely think about sort of just the cultural implications of having over the counter. I mean, of course, there are already over the counter methods that aren't hormonal, but just going further down that path. When you're growing up, you just see the world as it is, and you learn about, okay, this is what's normal just by what you see. And when birth control like that pills are available just over the counter, it is exactly, it teaches people that this is completely normal. This is how it works. You have sex once you're going through puberty, you just kind of start having sex. You totally don't need to have kids. That's not really a part of it. And just get married kind of later down the road, because see, like, oh, you can just buy these pills at the drugstore. Like, it's so casual, and it just continues to push sex and marriage further apart. And that has damaging implications for everyone, for people's development, for how you understand what sex is, and yeah, just teaching that it's basically meaningless. And also from a public health standpoint, kind of like I was saying before, you're just putting people at risk. And Corey, you were saying this too, people aren't doing their research. I think one thing that the article specifically mentioned that you brought up, Michelle, is so birth control is contraindicated if you have breast cancer. And so either some people don't really understand what it means, like, don't take this medication if you have this condition. They're like, well, I really need this medication, so I'm going to take it anyway.
Right.
Or just not knowing that you don't need any contact with a doctor or a pharmacist. That's what, again, like, this is taking away even the pharmacy component where you pick the medication up and they tell you, here's how to take it. That doesn't happen. You pick it up at the store, maybe read the instructions, maybe not. And so I think there's a lot of more potential for like user error in that sense that could be really, really dangerous for people. And then also another aspect is, like, I think this will cause a rise in STIs throughout, because it's sort of barrier methods are the only thing that are going to prevent that spread. And so if people are just able to get kind of whatever over-the-counter pill, they'll probably use less, potentially not use a barrier method. And so again, from a public health standpoint, I think that it's a bad idea, because these diseases then can just be transmitted that much more.
Yeah, you bring up a very good observation with STIs, right? So we know that STIs are much more frequent you're much more likely to get one the younger you engage in sexual intercourse, purely because of the way the body is designed, and how the body is still growing, right? So there's lots of good research out there about the development of a woman's body and how skin growth inside, and without getting too particular, right, in case there's any kids in the room, that really a woman isn't ready for sexual intercourse at a young age, and doesn't have the protective elements to prevent her from an STI. And typically, again, when you're using hormonal birth control, there's the idea that other methods aren't necessary. And so she puts herself at great risk, especially as a young person. So
I guess one last thing that I want to touch on before we move on to is, I think that this is also we're going to see a rise in, human trafficking. Those traffickers are going to be able to have easier access to this. And in the pornography industry, those are two things that, as Bonnie was talking about, STIs, I think are also going to benefit from this. And then we're going to see a lot more fallout in those areas, because there's not going to be any doctors needed. So these traffickers and people can just easily gain access to these pills and force people to go on it without needing a doctor's prescription to do so. And so we're taking away a protective factor for those who are being trafficked of, having mandatory reporting, because if anyone can go into a pharmacy like a Walgreens or a CVS and purchase these over the counter, you don't know who they're for.
Right.
Especially, as we have been talking about human trafficking and the pornography industry a lot recently. So that was one thing I also just wanted to bring up too before we moved on, because I think that's something else to consider that maybe hasn't been considered in all of this.
Right. Absolutely. Well, let's move on to that next news story. It's a lighter one, and Corey found this news story, so I'm going to hand it over to her to tell us about it.
Yeah, so this one is going to feel very different from our last story. I hope it's a good way to wrap up today. The title is Anti-Work Trends Like Lazy Girl Jobs Show How Young People Are Rallying Against Burnout Culture. So the article talks about this trend that is seen on the internet recently, especially TikTok, of lazy girl jobs, where it's a viral term that refers to well-paying, flexible jobs that allow for leisure time. And so things like work from home jobs or jobs that that have unlimited PTO, things like that. And the other thing that goes along, the other terms they bring up with this, with the anti-work trends, are quiet quitting, where people wouldn't even put in a 2 weeks. It would be basically a no call, no show situation. So that was one trend last year that they had talked about with this. They also talk about concepts like bed rotting, where you just lounge in bed for extended periods of time. And then the other one that's recently come up are the concept of girl dinners, where you basically have a snack plate for dinner instead of a fully prepped meal. But I really want to touch on the lazy girl jobs trend, like the article does here. One quote from the article that I want to talk about is that the creator that's really taken this says that decentering your 9 to 5 from your identity is so important, because if you don't, then you're kind of putting your eggs all in one basket that you can't necessarily control. So that's really what caught my attention with this is, we've seen trends in the past of the boomer generation and Gen X kind of putting all of their time and effort into a 9 to 5 job, and then maybe even giving more than their 40 hours a week, and how millennials and Gen Z especially are really trying to backtrack and have better work-life balance. So the first question I bring up is the article discusses several trends that have taken over social media lately, namely the lazy girl jobs. And then, do you think these trends support a healthy view of work-life balance and rest, despite the names like bed rotting, lazy girl job, thing like that? And do you think it's really helping to undo what maybe boomers see as what needs to be done at work?
Well, I can give my Gen Z, I believe I belong in Gen Z, take, which is, so I do think there can certainly be and is an overemphasis on work and sort of like, oh, just being a slave to the corporate machine or whatever that people are kind of used to. So certainly it's not a bad thing to emphasize that you should have work-life balance, and that your work is not, your occupation is not the only thing important in your life. But at the same time, I do kind of think that in the cases of many jobs, people's jobs don't really match up to 40 hours a week, but they work 9 to 5. And so they're not necessarily being maximally productive in their jobs throughout their day. And what this trend incentivizes is for you to be as productive as you possibly can, so that you can maybe get your work done in 30 hours. And then the idea is you should be able to use those 10 hours as you please, because you've gotten your work done. So, which I think is a great idea. But my point is that maybe everybody who works 40 hours a week isn't putting in 40 hours of good work. They just need to be there from 9 to 5, and their job's their job. So they're there, but they're not necessarily, when people shifted to working from home, suddenly they were able to get their work done a lot faster. And of course, this is not the case for everybody. I just think that people have kind of adopted this, yeah, we're slaves and we have to work so many hours and I should never have to go above and beyond. And in reality, their jobs aren't necessarily terribly demanding. They just kind of waste their time throughout their day. So maybe that's not the most politically correct or whatever take, but that's my 2 cents.
Okay, so I'm going to come in as a Gen Xer, right? So according to the article, part of the problem, right? But so here's the thing. I think it's important. I think this is something we've lost. And I think it's important to remember that work was a gift that was given in the garden. And so work is actually a good gift. It is, God gives Adam and Eve work to do, and that provides purpose for them, but it also gives them the opportunity to serve others. And so I think there are some good things about this movement. And I'll get to those in a minute, but I think there are also some inherently kind of rotten things, in that work is just something we have to do and get done with it and then move on to the things that are our real life. But our real life is actually about serving others, and it's about the vocations that God has placed us in to serve. So I think it's wrong to say this job is my life, right? And in that way, I think this movement is good because it makes us think about the other vocations and the other opportunities that God has placed in our lives, the other people he has placed in our lives that we are called to serve. And so balance is good. But I think looking at work as something just to get done so we can move on to something better is not good. And I don't think it's biblical. It's good to rest. But that rest is not only for us, but it is also to enable us to serve better, right? To serve others that God has placed in our lives. So I guess that's there. Whenever you see a movement, there's always good that you can, almost always good that you can pull from it. But also we have to see if inherently it is antithetical to what God says. And I think at its root, it kind of is, right? When you look at these influencers, they're talking about just the almost a refusal to recognize that work is a good part of life, that it gives meaning to our life as well, meaning and purpose. So that's my Gen Zers take, or Gen Xer take, sorry, not Gen Zer, but I have two Gen Zers in my own family, right? So I do see this tension there and this tendency toward moving away from that machine. And I get that. But I think that there's a balance. I think one last thing I would say is just Ephesians 6. So I looked up before we did our podcast, I looked at the table of duties in the catechism. And so we, again, going to pull in that catechism. What does God's word say about it? And there's lots of great references in there. But to workers of all kind, I would encourage us to kind of look at Ephesians 6, 5-8. And one of the things that God says in that verse is serve wholeheartedly as if you were serving the Lord, not men, because you know that the Lord will reward everyone for whatever good he does. And then whether, he's a worker or whether he is a supervisor, those sorts of things. So I think when we see our work as an opportunity to serve God, as an opportunity to reflect him, to recognize this as a vocation, a calling God has placed us in, to uphold lives, and that the work that we're doing is for him, not for the business, right? Or not for just something to get done, but that it has meaning. I think that work becomes significant and a gift. So, okay, I'll hand it over to somebody else.
Yeah. Well, so I am, as the millennial, and granted, I'm millennial on the cusp of Gen Z, so I have a little bit of a different view on all of this too. But I think even millennials were given the idea more that Gen X and boomers had, where you put in your 40 hours a week, and if you need to go above and beyond, you do. But I also see where Bonnie was saying that the 40 hours in the office, that 9 to 5, maybe you're not terribly productive in that 40 hours. So I see both sides of it a little bit more. And Michelle, you already answered my next question, which is, do we think that these trends, do they affirm what the Bible has to say? And I just wanted to tie off that too of, we see in Matthew 5:16 that our work and our deeds, they are to glorify our Father in heaven. They're not for us, but they are for others and to ultimately show the love of Christ to those that we serve. So one of the things I talked about in this article too was that with COVID, remote work became a lot more popular. So all three of us work remotely, and Lutherans for Life was remote before COVID. So there's a little bit of a new.
It was remote before remote was cool.
Yeah, we were remote before remote. Just put it out there.
Yeah. So we've all been kind of in the we've got coworkers that have been doing this a lot longer than COVID. So do you think that being able to work remotely gives the adequate flexibility to get your work done, your commitments done, but also to spend time with your family or do things outside, fulfill all of your vocations that maybe a standard 9 to 5 in an office wouldn't allow you to do? And I know Bonnie's situation is different since she's part-time, but that plays into it as well of, full-time remote work versus part-time remote work, just things to think about.
Yeah, well, I can just hop in and say, so yeah, it is very different for me because I'm not working 40 hours a week from home. I work 10 to 15, which is very, very different. But like, I don't think I would do an in-person part-time job because I have a son who I'm taking care of. And so because I'm here currently, I'm actually sitting at my parents' house, not my house, but like my sister is watching James, my son, while I do this. And it's just so convenient to just be able to drive over here, set my little thing up. So anyway, now you know the ins and outs of where I'm sitting and what but the point
Bonnie's
is,
like,
there are huge benefits to remote work, and I can fit aside from meetings, I can fit my hours in absolutely pretty much any time in the week. So I work in the evenings a lot after my son goes to bed or during his naps, or if I'm up really early, I can work in the morning. And there's no commute time, and there's no extended childcare and all the prep that goes into that, getting snacks and bottles and bibs and whatever that I have to. So it's extremely flexible, and I think it's a wonderful way to be able to then, exactly like you were saying, Michelle, turn to your other vocations and be able to fulfill those even better because you do have all of that flexibility in your week.
Yeah, and I love that flexibility too. You guys know because we saw Bonnie's Life 101 just a minute ago, but the two of you know Michelle's Life 101 is I am more than a 40-hour a weeker, right? Because that is the work that I am engaged in doing, and probably I love that flexibility. I think that's one of the gifts of remote work. But I think also part of it is that it beckons to you, right? So it's on my desk in my home. And so it is for me sometimes hard to step away and say, okay, I really do have another vocation because it's always reminding me it's there. But again, when I worked outside of my home, that was there was always a beckon there too. So we always have we live in a broken world, and we are always tempted to idolize different areas of our lives, right? To say that this is more important than this, to place this one gift over another gift. And so the difficult reality of living as both saint and sinner is to recognize all the gifts that God has given and to value them and to rejoice in them, right? Whether that's the vocation of mom and making dinner, or wife and spending time with my husband, or whether it is also doing what's necessary so that my two assistants can do their job, right? Or serving the youth that I serve. So I think it doesn't necessarily matter where we work. I think until in my opinion, until my dying day, right? There will always be a struggle to balance those gifts and all good gifts, but to know how to spend your time in the best way to serve, because there's so much to do and so many people to serve, right? So those are my thoughts.
Yeah, no, and I think too, Michelle, you said it beckons to you. And I think a lot of something my dad said to me a couple of years ago when I was leaving my first quote unquote big kid job, when I had my son and I stayed home with him for a bit, I cried my last day, and he said that's because it was a good vocation for you in that season. And I think that's very true of when that work beckons to you, when you have those tugs on your heartstrings, or you have that urge to get something done. That's a good vocation for you. You know you're in the right field. And something that sticks out to me, especially with this lazy girl job trend, is, yes, maybe we should have more work-life balance, but if you don't want to do the work, maybe that's not where God needs you to be. And I know that sometimes a job is just a means to an end while you find a better fit, because you need to have an income to be able to pay rent or your mortgage, to be able to provide for yourself and others. But I think a vocation is something that should beckon to you. You know, we're all moms, and so we all want to care for our children. We're all wives. We all want to spend time with our husbands, but we're all also employees in an organization where our values and our beliefs align, and we all want to do the work. And so I think that's important too, is finding that job, that vocation where you feel like you want to do the work and you're excited to go to work in the morning, or you're excited to hop on the computer at home in the morning, or wherever your work hours are set up to do that work. I think that's important to remember too, that your vocation should beckon to you, like you said, Michelle. And I think that's something that the new trends have often forgotten, that we just work because we have to, not because it's something that we're passionate about.
So it is a gift to have something that you are passionate about. That is definitely a gift. And I think it would be normal to say that we don't always have that throughout our life. And to rejoice in the opportunity to do the work, even the work that is, I think about some of my first jobs, and yet it provided for me, right? And it taught me the skills that I needed. And even in these difficult times, and there have been, difficult times in each career, but even in those difficult times where you feel, oh man, just not really feeling it today, right? Even then, God is at work in your life for good. And he is using that work to bless others. And so again, just to remember that whether we're going in or whether we're staying home, whether we're working from home or working in person, we get to be God's witnesses in the place he has placed us in. And through difficult times, through joyful ones, right? When we're passionate and when we're not feeling that passion, we are still able to be messengers and called to be those messengers. When we look at what God has asked us to do, he has asked us to love our neighbor as ourselves, and to pray for all people, those things. And we love our neighbors when we do our work well, right? When we serve, no matter what vocation God has placed us in.
Yeah. So my last question for us to consider with this is, how can we better reframe the lazy girl job trend as life-affirming Christians? So what are things that we can do to reframe this with our peers, or when we see these things online, how can we reframe for ourselves to know that our work is good and that there is purpose behind it?
Well, as I was thinking about this earlier, I actually, Michelle, took pretty much the exact same approach that you did with vocation, which is just to understand work and all of life in terms of vocation. And so I think the idea with the lazy girl job trend is you're freeing up more of your time so that you can go live for yourself or really live, like you were saying, Michelle, that work isn't really your life. And so you need to get more time so you can go really live your life and live for yourself. And in reality, we should see our job as a gift for one, but also as one of our many vocations. And so if your job is eclipsing your ability to live out your vocation as a parent or a spouse, or whatever else, maybe you have really, really crazy hours, or an incredibly stressful work environment that you're taking home with you every day and it's causing issues with your family, then you probably do need to figure out a way to fix that so that you can serve the people that God has placed more near to you, your family, than your job. And so you need to figure out a way to fulfill those vocations better. So I do think the idea, like you, I think Corey read that quote about decentering from your 9-to-5, decentering that from your identity, I think is a good one. But instead of filling then that void with your own perception of yourself or whatever your really great hobbies are that you do with all your extra time, you should be filling it first with your identity in Christ. So that's prioritizing church, reading God's word, praying, those kinds of things. If you have time for those things, you need to make time for those things. But then also our other vocations should then fill up that identity. So being a friend, sibling, parent, child. So being less tied to your occupation, your 9 to 5, means that you're more free to tie yourself to service to others in our lives. And I mean, Michelle, you basically already said all of that. But I was just thinking the exact same thing in terms of vocation and understanding that all of life is service and all of life is work in a sense, even if it's not a 9 to 5.
Yep. And all of that work is life affirming, right? And I think it's important to recognize that lazy girl job, that title that is meant to be satirical, right? It's meant to kind of be a little bit brash when we're talking about it. And again, that's not a title that we have given it, but even just the idea that laziness is tied to not spending your entire day at work, I think is also false, right? And so we do redefine as Christians what the purpose of work is, and that work is a gift, but we also embrace the fact that God gives us different times, different opportunities to rest, to rejuvenate, again, for the benefit of others, and to rejoice in that. So I'm not sure that we could like have a different name. Maybe we could come up with a different name, but overall, I think finding that balance and recognizing those vocations is a positive spin on the lazy girl job trend.
Yeah, and I think it's one too that, yes, Michelle, you mentioned this is supposed to be satirical, but maybe we use that as an opportunity to tell others who may see their job as their whole identity to reframe, say, there's this trend going on about making your office job just an office job, and then you can focus on the things outside of that. Because I will say there are still millennials and Gen Zers who are focused solely on their work identity and nothing else. And I think, again, going back to the identity part, your identity first and foremost is in being a child of God, and all of your other vocations flow from that. So whether it's employee, mom, sister, friend, things like that, you remember first that I'm a child of God and he gives me the work to do. He gives me my vocations. And that's something to think about too, as we navigate this new trend online, is that when we work for the Lord.
Right. Absolutely. That is a good place to end. So thanks for joining us this week, or this episode, on Table Talks for Life. We hope you join us on the next one as well. Please like and share. We would love for more people to hear the gospel-motivated message for life. Have a great week. Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining the Y for Life team for today's Table Talk for Life. We hope you're better equipped to address today's life issues and uphold the people God has placed in your path. Be sure to check out our programs and resources at yforlife.org, or email Michelle at yforlife.org to find out more about how you can be a gospel-motivated voice for life. And we hope you'll join us next time, right here at Youth for Life Podcasts.